Oh, hello, it's me. And welcome to my presentation on home labs. I did a presentation a couple times last year before Corona hit on HelSec and Turkusec, and I was intending to give the same talk in HelSec as well, but Corona happened and we had to postpone the home lab themed meetup until right now. And about me, so my name is Ossi. I used to be a developer for like 20 years in various roles, different companies, and I got a master's in electrical engineering. And currently I'm working as chief security architect at Sanoma Media Finland. I'm working on our application security program and working on a bunch of other cool stuff. And my other security related affiliations include HelSec, obviously, and I'm also a member of TallinnSec and Turkusec and contribute to Disobey, and also I'm a KubeVP co-volunteer. And I like to play with and hack stuff, and got my OSCP 2 years ago. And currently I'm actually working on the kind of next level course from the OSCP, which is the PEN 300, and that's plenty of fun. And when I'm not hacking things, I'm usually outside riding a bike or paddling or something. Anyway, in this talk I'm going to describe my home lab setup, like what's the basic infrastructure, and after that I hope you will ask many questions and I hope to be able to answer them. And kind of my home lab setup is the next step, what comes after what Mariana described in her talk tonight. So when I started transitioning into cybersecurity, I of course experimented a lot with virtual machines and things, and I was running them on my own laptop. But there are of course always limits to how much you can do with only one laptop and how many VMs you can run at one time. So my setup is currently spanning multiple PCs, and I'm going to talk about that setup tonight. So here anyway I'm defining home lab as the whatever environment you have at home with all those computers and networks that you may wish to run. And why would you actually want to have a home lab? Well, of course, you can run a lot of servers, virtually and physically, and services. You can play around and play with things, try out different OSs, and run all the cool stuff from, for example, VulnHub, vulnerable VMs, play CDF at your home, and simulate networks, and just like see what's going on. So it's basically a way to do self-study in your own environment. And in my case, so anyway, these are the things I want out of my home lab. So of course, I want to have like normal internet connectivity for doing the important stuff like gaming and browsing the internet and doing work. Remote work is fairly obviously a requirement these days. And I also want to have separate networks for special purposes, like I have an Active Directory network and I might research IoT devices and vulnerable VMs and studying maybe malware or some stuff that need to be segmented very well from all the other stuff I'm running. And for OSINT and other purposes, I have one LAN that routes all of its traffic through a VPN, so whatever comes out of that network doesn't seem to like physically exit my home network, so it's going through VPN. And I also want to have wireless access points for all of those networks. So for example, if I'm doing OSINT and I need an actual like physical phone to do whatever OSINT things, I'm connecting that to the special wireless access point that routes all of its traffic through a VPN. And optimally also I would like to take part of my home lab with me, so if I have some virtual machines I want to be able to use like on the go somewhere else, like on, well, hacker conventions, whatever, I want to be able to take some of that with me. So it's not all like very bulky pieces. I have a small machine that can run some of the VMs as well. And here's a network diagram I made myself. So basically, here I can see that there are a couple LANs and firewalls and things. Anyway, one of the questions is how do I actually create different networks and network segments so that I can have all those different things in their own networks. And I'm going to talk about a concept called VLAN or virtual LAN. So here's a very short summary of what the TCP/IP stack looks like. So on the very bottom we have the physical stuff going on, which is basically voltage on wires or radiation in case of wireless LAN, or we can even run packets on top of carrier pigeons. There's an RFC for that. And the layer directly above the physical layer is the link layer, and VLAN is something that happens right there. So it's basically an extension to the Ethernet standard, and virtual LAN basically means it's how you share a physical network with like logical networks on top of it. And if you ever look at network capture tools, you see that like all of those packets are built on a concept called frame. So there's a frame header that describes the contents of the packet. There's metadata, and the actual payload is kind of the payload of the layer above what you're looking at. So in case of Ethernet, there's some metadata that specifies that it's actually a virtual Ethernet packet and not a physical one. And if you want to run VLANs on an actual physical network, you need networking equipment that supports running VLANs. And in my home lab, I'm using a device from Zixel. And the reason I chose this particular type of switch was that it was the cheapest one that supported VLANs. But anyway, if you have a network switch that supports VLANs, you basically configure it using some sort of a GUI or telnet or whatever, and define that these particular ports can participate in a VLAN whose ID is something. So this is a screenshot from my switch web user interface. And your router also needs to support VLANs, and in my case I'm using pfSense as a router. So I'm just using the router user interface to configure that whatever those VLANs do. And these are just like sample screenshots of the router user interface. So in my case there's a kind of production LAN which is by default accessible on all switch ports, and then there are a couple VLANs that I use for virtual machines for different purposes. And well, anyway, that was a short introduction to VLANs. You may Google it up and look for yourself what's in it. But the most interesting part here is how I configure my servers in my home lab. I'm using software called Proxmox. It's a virtualization platform, which means it's basically an operating system you install on a computer, and after that it's a platform to run virtual machines. And the pros, of course, obviously it's open source, which means that you can use it without limitation and do whatever you want with it. And another cool feature is that you can create clusters. So you can take multiple pieces, create a cluster out of them, and within that cluster you can run virtual machines and you can migrate them to other physical nodes. And another pro thing I really like that it seems to be fairly stable. I'm running multiple PCs running Proxmox, and their uptimes are easily hundreds of days, and it hasn't caused any problems so far. And maybe on the con side, I don't know. I mean, I'm mostly happy with Proxmox. In some cases, I've noticed it's not super easy to use for some more complex scenarios. For example, Before Corona happened, I used to take one of my Proxmox hosts with me. It's a very small Intel NUC based computer, so it's basically a small PC and size about maybe 1 or 2 beer cans in volume, so it's like really small, smaller than a laptop. And if I create a large cluster of which this Intel NUC is a node, then I end up with problems if I do changes on the cluster while one of these nodes is kind of outside the rest of the nodes, and I create VMs and so on, and whenever this one machine rejoins the cluster, some of the changes may get lost. But other than that, it's fairly easy to use. And you can actually use Proxmox to do whatever you would do with any other virtualization platform, including VirtualBox or VMware. You can just use the web GUI to create VMs and run them and use ISO images, create disks and so on. So it supports whatever needs you have for virtual machines. And in my particular case, I'm using a couple of Lenovo workstations, and I bought them used because they're available used. They don't really cost much, considering they're like fairly pro server grade platforms and like Xeon processors and lots of memory and so on. And of course, I've added all of those old PCs I have lying around running Proxmox as well. And I have an Intel NUC, which I just mentioned. It's basically a new thing, very small PC, powerful. And that's the one I'm taking with me when I'm going like places. And also this particular presentation PowerPoint Windows thing is running virtually on one of those machines, so I'm actually sharing a remote desktop to that virtual PC. And I'm of course going to show some demos. So Proxmox is based on some Linux variant, maybe Debian, I don't know. And I created a cool script called create VM. So I've created like templates of some of the operating systems I use fairly often, for example, Linux or Debian and Ubuntu and Kali. So I can, for example, list all of my VMs, and there are plenty, and I have a couple VMs that I've put the name template in their name. So if I, for example, want to create myself a new Debian, I would type something like this. So right here I would create a VM called demo, and I'm giving it like 5 GB more disk than the template has, 2 gigs of memory and 4 cores. And what it's doing right now, it's creating a clone of my template and allocating the disk and resources and so on. And now it's already booting up. And I've configured my template so that whenever it starts, the first thing it does, it's running up to get update and upgrade and so on. And in a couple of minutes, I have a running Debian system. Other demos, I can show the Proxmox Gui. So it's basically a web GUI. In addition to being able to access it over SSH, I hope you can actually see what's going on here. I'm trying to zoom it in. I'm creating a VM called Funny, and looking at my ISO images, I have something called Temple OS. I think the OS type is other, and I'm giving it 1 GB of disk, and whatever defaults are probably just fine. So I'll create this funny machine. and it seems like I've got the Temple OS installer, which is nice. And also, while I was doing this, my demo box was already done installing, so it's a Debian box. We can go back to the presentation. One cool thing here is, so I showed I was creating a Debian VM out of a template. So there's this thing called CloudInit, and it's kind of a post-installation config tool for virtual machines. And it's available in most or all Linux distros, so you can install CloudInit using apt on Debian and Ubuntu and so on. So the idea is that you create kind of a template or master image of a virtual machine, you install CloudInit on it, and in a couple of configuration files you can kind of define configuration specific to your own environment. So for example, in my case, I'm configuring that I cannot users, that's a standard feature, and those users get installed SSH keys and whatever else. So you can, for example, make sure that your template is using Puppet or Ansible or whatever kind of orchestration tools post-installation, so that you can easily build infrastructure in the same way you would be like using those commercial cloud providers as well, such as like AWS and so on. And for Windows, there's something called Cloudbase Init. I haven't really tested it yet. I haven't had reason to use it so far. And I'll show you another demo as well. I mentioned I have a Active Directory set up. And because I enjoyed experimenting with Windows installations, I created a Windows boot environment, which I'm not sure if it works, but we'll see. If I start this thing, I should be seeing a virtual machine doing a network boot. It actually seems to work. So in this instance, if I want a fresh installation of Windows server or workstation or whatever, I should be able to get that by just creating a new virtual machine and booting it off network. I think I'm running out of slides and things to say, so maybe Juho can chime in and ask me questions.
Yes, I'm here.
Nice.
I think you cannot show my beautiful face, so I will be acting as a only speaking host. Yes, you have a few questions here. The first one, have you considered using containerized setups like K8s? I think there you can use the Linux kernel itself for network segmentation.
No, I haven't been doing that.
All right. Did you try to pro-v on FXB the Tuxel password on your Tuxel?
Oh yes, I did.
Did it work?
No.
Okay, so your device was not vulnerable, right?
No, it wasn't.
Poor
yeah,
you.
I mean that was one of the first things I did when I learned of the vulnerability.
What do you think, is public cloud good for building homelab?
I haven't actually tried that, but I think building a homelab out of physical hardware is maybe a better idea, because the resources you actually need isn't that much. So you can basically, like, I assume most people have old laptops or old PCs lying around, and if they don't, they're for sale in, for example, Tori.fi for a couple tens of euros. But I mean, depends on what you want to do. So with commercial cloud providers, you can easily kind of get going, but if you want to concentrate on more like the low-level stuff, like the OS images themselves and how you set things up, then I think it's a better idea to host it yourself on your own hardware.
Do you know if you can use Vagrant to orchestrate Proxmox?
I have absolutely no idea.
All right. So the next question, is year 2021 the year of the Linux desktop?
I think it's a year of the Temple OS desktop.
Yeah, that was the second question. The next question was that one. So
No, I don't know. I've been using Linux as my main box for a long time, and one thing I'd like to mention here is, as I mentioned, I started as Mariana did, so I was running VMs on my own laptop, and I just realized it's not viable to buy a large enough laptop to do everything on one machine, so I kind of ended up, because I needed a new laptop anyway, I bought a fairly basic low-end Lenovo laptop I'm using as a terminal with Linux, and kind of all the cool stuff is living in a virtual machine somewhere. So kind of my production setup at both at work and private stuff is that I'm using a Linux laptop as a desktop, and whatever else I need is basically a virtual machine, except gaming, of course.
all right. So is the year 2021 the year of the Proxmox desktop?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. What's your favorite router OS?
Mm, so I'm running pfSense like on physical PCs on all of my networks, and also running some pfSense VMs for those weird setups within my kind of Proxmox setup. I'm not too familiar with other router operating systems at this time, but seems to be fairly easy to use and supports all the features I need in like even involving routing whole networks through a VPN, like upstream VPN.
All right. Have you tried running Proxmox in nested virtualization?
So far I don't, but I can't easily see why I would want to do that.
And the last question is about your main system where you run your virtuals. What is the CPU? How much memory, etc.?
Um, the kind of main system consists of two machines. One of them is one of these old Lenovo S30 workstations. It's basically a large tower PC-looking desktop. It's got a Xeon processor, 8 cores, 64 gigs of memory, and I think 1 gig of SSD and a couple terabytes, or 1 terabyte of SSD and a couple terabytes hard disk. And that combined with the Intel NUC running kind of similar specs, 32 gigs of memory and i9 or i7, 1 terabyte of SSD. And I have a couple more boxes running Proxmox, but because of weird clustering reasons, I'm kind of running clusters with 2 nodes only.
Alrighty then. Thank you very much, Osku. And we will have a few second break, and then I will say the closing mark. So don't go anywhere yet.
Thank you. And I'll be on Discord as well in the after party, so feel free to ask me more questions then.
Yep. See you in a few minutes.
Yes, thank
Few
you.
seconds. Bye.
Bye.